Alright, so this is going to be a review of World War II and really its implications worldwide. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit for the remainder of our discussion with kind of the climate in Europe and around the world in some places, really on the eve of World War II. So what happened? Really, you had a lot of resentment over World War One and really the end of World War One, especially with the Treaty of Versailles and how some of these belligerent powers had been treated at the end. And with the worldwide economic depression that was taking place, you had a number of people that were able to take advantage of the people's fear and their anger and resentment over their issues with the end of World War One and take control really fully in these countries. These dictators, did things like promise a better life and really a glorious future in a nationalistic way for these countries. And, as a result, it really was appealing to the masses. And just really a comparison that we used in class, especially, was this video The Wave and this experiment of this social studies teacher in California who was able to manipulate his students into believing in this grand idea of this wave and was able to essentially brainwash them to get them to really fully buy into this and really show them the implications of blindly following these type of leaders. The first of these dictators that we are going to kind of really discuss, and really only briefly, is this man named Benito Mussolini, who came to power in Italy as the leader of this fascist party, really advocating for a sense of this extreme nationalism and really racism as well. And Mussolini was able to come to power, really forcing the king to recognize him as the leader. And he was able to take control and end a lot of these liberties and of things that people had normally had previously, things like free press, and ultimately started to brainwash the people and the kids toward a loyalty to the country in a very nationalistic sense. And while he came into control and during his power, he really pushed into North Africa, into Ethiopia and Albania in particular. And this is really going to set the stage for where the Allies are going to be really trying to push into Europe first before we were to go into Normandy. Next, we are going to again briefly talk about the Emperor of Japan, whose name was Hirohito. And Hirohito was the emperor, so he really had absolute authority and final say in what was going on. Although many are going to argue also that he was being really a puppet of the military leaders in Japan. So whatever you really want to believe there, but either way, Japan was had adopted imperialistic policies. They had rapidly industrialized once the United States had kind of come knocking on their door during our imperialistic phase. And once Japan had kind of caught up to the rest of the world, they realized the benefits to having an imperialistic attitude and the option and the ability to gather colonies. And Japan being a small island for itself, it really needed a large area and large amount of resources to really fuel this industrial boom that Japan had really between the late 1800s and during the early part of the 20th century. So they pushed into Manchuria and China and really did it for those resources, but really as a sense of kind of superiority as well to these other Asian people. And really one of the most striking aspects of the Japanese imperialism into Asia and mainland Asia is really this rape of Nanking. That is it's this really horrible instance where Japan had kind of come in and really did absolutely horrible things to these people in this area of China, raping, killing, murdering, pillaging, everything, all of the above, and really treating these people in really absolutely horrendous ways. Here you have an image from this rape of Nanking, and when you have a Japanese soldier standing essentially really pridefully in front of this wall of dead Chinese soldiers and people, and it really just kind of shows this sentiment of superiority and really not caring at all about what they had done and the atrocities that they had committed here. The most famous of these dictators that had come to power in this interwar period really is obviously Adolf Hitler, who came to power in Germany as the head of this Nazi party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And in particular, this is the one that was really feeding on the discontent from how they were treated at the end of World War One with the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations that they had to pay and the economic depression that really was the result of a lot of those things. The country had experienced extreme inflation, unemployment, and the people in the country were really having a rough time. And they pushed this rhetoric and propaganda really of racial views toward the Jewish as the scapegoat for these problems, which is really the standard narrative there. And Hitler was a proponent of this totalitarianism, or really, I guess, an example of this totalitarianism, in which a political system, in which a state holds really the total authority of the society and seeks to control all aspects of the public and private life wherever possible, really as a textbook definition. Here you have an image of a rally, a Nazi rally. You can see the people's hands out in salute in this what's known as this Cathedral of Light, and it's just kind of showing the sheer number of people that were able to be influenced by this propaganda and this sentiment following World War One and that interwar period, and it really just goes to show you the scope of this. And the next image is going to really show that as well. So this is another Nazi rally, a big Nazi rally in Nuremberg, and looking at this is it's really again even more so shows the scope of all of this and the thousands, if not tens of thousands, even maybe even hundreds of 100,000 or so people that are here to kind of rally in support of the Nazi Party. It just goes to show the large number of people that were able to be manipulated in really the similar style to what we had seen in that video, The Wave. Joseph Stalin is probably the other most famous of the ones that we are talking about, and he was the leader of the Soviet Union, which is the communist form of the Russian state that had become communist at the end of World War One. And Stalin was really known for his harsh demeanor and his hard personality, and he's not a really nice person. He is known for ordering the deaths of his rivals in opposition, so anyone who really opposed him didn't really make it in a lot of cases. He looked for really complete obedience from his people, put millions of Russian Soviet people into labor camps by this organization known as the Gulags. He opened up these government-owned farms that essentially, again, pushed these citizens into working here, and he's responsible for really, you could say, the deaths of a large number of these citizens between these camps and his policies with the war. So now that the stage has been set, we're going to kind of talk about the onset of this war and the beginning. You have really right before the war in August of 1939, you have the Soviet Union and Germany actually coming together in a non-aggression pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and really it's an agreement between the two of them to not really fight one another, but also to divide up some of the land that you're going to be seeing Germany moving in on, and then ultimately Russia as well. So right after this agreement, you get the German invasion of Poland on September 1st in this what's known as this Blitzkrieg attack. Blitzkrieg meaning this lightning war. And from the other side, you actually had Russia pushing in as well, looking to claim some of the land that this agreement that they had signed with Germany, taking control of and taking influence of there. You also have some fighting between them, between the Russians up in Finland as well, which is really kind of funny because obviously later in the war you have the Russians actually on the Allied side and not siding with Germany. So it's really a 180 when you have Germany a bit later in this war just kind of drop this pact and actually go in and invade Russia as well. But we'll get to that in a little bit. You have Germany, once they've invaded Poland, they also push into France, and they are very quickly get through France, and you actually have a push of Allied forces really all the way to the English Channel, and you get these Allied forces, especially British Allied forces, that are looking to get away. You have Germany move in so quickly and so powerfully that they really weren't able to mount any real defensive, and this is what we're talking about at Dunkirk, which you see right there. Dunkirk is this area where Britain was fortunately able to hold off the Germans long enough to get really almost 400,000 troops to safety across the Channel back to Great Britain. And really, if this hadn't happened, this might have been over right here. France surrendered not really much longer after, on June 14th in 1940, and you actually had the Axis powers, or Germany really, march right into Paris and take control of France. So you had Germany not really looking to give up their offensive advantage, and once they had really control of really the entire European mainland continent, Hitler took the fight to Great Britain, really in a series of air raids, and what this becomes really known as the Battle of Britain. You had Germany really bombing out entire neighborhoods in England, in London, and other major cities in England as well. And this was relatively indiscriminate too. You have the killing of civilians, and this opens up a can of worms for later in the war, obviously. But the Germans hoped to really break the British morale before any invasion, which they were obviously hoping to be able to accomplish. Winston Churchill, who would be the leader of the British and the English at the time, him and this Royal Air Force were ultimately able to repel a number of these German attacks and really not allow Germany to get to a point where they're going to be able to invade into Great Britain, which would have obviously, again, really changed how this war would have ended up had that been able to. Here you will see some images of this Battle of Britain, and this one, I like this one in particular. It is a series, it's a group of these contrails, which are really the exhausts and such of these fighter planes that are fighting over Great Britain. And this is obviously right over London, as you can see Big Ben right there in the frame. And Big Ben is a part of the British Parliament building. So it's really kind of showing you how close this was in London, and how this was really going on. It's really interesting to see, imagine this happening over something like the Empire State Building in New York or something that iconic. It's really obviously would be super close to home. So this image is another image from this Battle of Britain, and it's really showing the devastation and the destruction that these German bombings were doing. And here you have a little girl who's obviously looking pretty sad. Her home must have been destroyed, and she's holding this doll. Maybe she doesn't even know where her parents are. It kind of gives you a little bit more of the human element of this as well. This next one, I like this one as well. It's a interesting picture. It's showing these men kind of just not really just going about their ordinary daily lives, even amidst all of these attacks and these bombings, as they're looking through a library to take out, I guess, material or take out books. And this library had obviously been destroyed for the most part, and except for the books, which again shows the resilience of some people in these type of situations. So as this fighting was going on in Europe, the United States was really again trying to attempt to stay out of this and really not getting involved in these foreign wars. They were really hoping for a sense of isolationism again, very similar to World War One, right? This is a European war. The United States had lended hand in World War One. We had lost, a number of men there. We put a lot of supplies and effort into World War One at the end there to help kind of finally break that standstill. We don't really want to get involved again here if we don't have to. And there's lots of arguments saying, Roosevelt, who was president at the time, really did want to get involved, and that kind of shown by his actions. But the American public was really staunchly against getting involved. As a means of trying to help, even with not fully getting into the war, Roosevelt was able to get past what's known as this Lend-Lease Act, which was this act that allowed the United States to sell or kind of lend or lease these weapons and these armaments to the countries in Europe, to help get really to help push back the Nazis. And there's this quote from him, saying this is vital to the defense of the United States to be able to do this. And we even were signed what's known as this Atlantic Charter with Great Britain in particular, that was trying to set goals for the final destruction of the Nazis and pushing back the Germans and really the end of this war. And they were trying to really discuss things like the nations that were affected would ultimately be able to have self-determination. They would be able to decide what they were looking for, as far as a country, the type of government they were looking for, and they would ultimately urge disarmament because weapons have gotten so powerful at this point that this disarmament and wars of this scope and scale are so devastating to the world completely, really. Since you have the United States kind of choosing a side with the Lend-Lease Act and the Atlantic Charter, choosing the side of the Allies in Great Britain, you begin to have tensions kind of starting to arise with the Japanese, who had kind of been more leaning toward the side of Hitler and the Axis powers. The Japanese, remember, had been following these imperialistic policies, really advocated for mostly by a man named Fuminaro Konoye and Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo being one of the main military commanders who is pictured here. These policies really sparked the United States to kind of apply really some economic pressures to them. Things like the Rape of Nanking and their policies in China really forced the United States to kind of reconsider any agreements they had with the Chinese, and they stopped selling oil. They froze Japanese bank assets and stuff like that. And as a result of that, you are going to get the Japanese beginning to kind of try to figure out a way to kind of deal a blow to the United States and try to really save face on the world. These policies of the United States kind of refusing to sell oil and such to Japan, who had been really needing that oil to fuel their war efforts on mainland Asia. It really leaves the Japanese between a rock and a hard place, and what they choose to do is actually to attack the United States in a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This attack takes place on December 7th, 1941, and this is quoted as FDR here in his famous quote saying, "A day which will live in infamy." Of course, once they attack Pearl Harbor, the United States is forced to declare war on Japan, kind of removing any possibility of the United States staying neutral in this conflict. And immediately after the United States declares war on Japan, the Japanese allies, in particularly Germany and as well as Italy, actually declare war on the United States. And just like that, we now have a global conflict that's going to be taking place. This is actually a picture of Pearl Harbor that was taken from an aerial view really a little over a month before the attacks. And what you can see here is really these ships that are all lined up essentially in a row, which is one of the reasons why it's called Battleship Row. And these ships are kind of paired up. If you look really closely, they're 2 by 2 right there. And this is one of the reasons why the attacks of the Japanese in such a surprising manner are really so catastrophic. You essentially have the Japanese come in a couple different waves, dropping bombs and such on these ships, catching the Americans really completely unaware. And you have about 2,400 Americans killed with about a little over 1,000 wounded. So It's devastating for a couple of different reasons. One, it's one of the largest attacks against Americans ever, and also it completely destroys our Pacific fleet and our Pacific capabilities. And that's obviously going to be a big deal kind of going forward, and really also for the Japanese, because they're able to get such a strong foothold in the Pacific kind of immediately following, and really around the same time as these attacks. This is another picture of the wreckage, just kind of going to show you kind of more of the ground level of some of these attacks. And this next image here is an example of the type of plane that was flying this mission on against Pearl Harbor, and also around in the Pacific, these Japanese fighter planes here that really did a number of damage, and they became known as the Japanese Zero, and that is obviously as a result of the red sun that is resembling the Japanese the flag there on the side of the plane. It looks like a zero from either perspective, and that is why it got its nickname. So these attacks on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and now this war that had broken out with the Japanese, really leads to a wave of xenophobia by the United States and by American citizens, really against anyone of Japanese heritage. Japanese American citizens were really rounded up and placed in essentially concentration camps with sometimes little to no advance notice. People were forced to kind of just move and give up everything, and they were forced to live in these substandard living conditions, really as a result of this fear that the United States had for these people now. They were worried about spies and sabotage and stuff like that. And there's a really great TED talk done by George Takei, who was on in one of these concentration camps when he was younger, and he does a really great talk on it, and you should really take a look at that if you have not yet already. And you can get a link to that. You can just YouTube it, and you should be able to find it. It's really a great talk, and really provides a great examples of what and why this was taking place. So we now are in this war fully at this point, and really it starts in the Pacific. And this image here is really just as a meant to show you how large the Pacific Ocean really is. It's enormous, and like looking in this frame, it really covers almost the entire view of this satellite image. You can see Australia there down on the very bottom, and the southwest here. You've got Japan, and really the eastern side of Asia over here. You've got the Aleutian Islands up into Alaska, and then ultimately the western side of the United States with Hawaii here in the middle. But this war is going to be taking place, on these small islands, all speckled throughout this ocean, and it's going to be really an interesting war, and it can be very different than the war that's going to be fought in the European. Pearl Harbor was not just the main attack here. The Japanese had calculated this out a long time beforehand, and their offensive was more so than just at Pearl Harbor. They took out airfields at Wake, and they attacked Guam really at the same time. And really just within the days after Pearl Harbor, they continued on to take Thailand, and Hong Kong, and really mid that month, they even went into the Philippines, where they took control of, and they were able to capture the American and Filipino troops that were stationed there. And there's a really famous, horrible incident that took place with these American and Filipino troops by the Japanese, and they had basically force marched these Filipino and American POWs, or prisoner of war, and they marched them in these brutal conditions, and roughly 21,000 of them died on these marches that were really between their bases and where they were captured to these prisoner of war camps. And those prisoner of war camps by the Japanese were pretty rough conditions, and we read a little segment about that with from the book, the excerpt from the book Unbroken, and the conditions, in these POW camps were very similar to what you read in that passage. So here you have a nice little piece of propaganda. It's asking, what are you going to do about it? And it's really saying that you should stay on the job until every one of these murdering Japanese people, I'm talking about the Japanese, obviously, soldiers that had done this to our Americans in the Philippines. You can see the little clipping here. This is why you are going, why you should be enraged, that about 5,200 American prisoners were killed by Japanese torture in this cruel march of death described. And that's kind of referring to what we had just talked about, this Bataan Death March. And I think it just kind of shows you the attitude and sentiment of our country kind of following these things, and how we viewed these people. And obviously, this is also meant to elicit a certain reaction and emotion in the people to get them fired up to join the war, or make sure that they are taking place in the production needed at home to really fuel the war efforts, or maybe even just giving money to the war effort. Fortunately for the United States, you get a bit of a momentum shift in the Pacific after a little while. The first one really has to do with something known as the Doolittle Raid, and it's actually a bombing raid that is pushed against Japan, actually, and hits Tokyo. They strike a couple targets there, and they move and fly over into allied area of China. But this, it's really just, it's more of a morale, really, is what it increases. There's no real actual significant importance of it. It didn't really take out any major military targets, but the morale of the country, it really needed this little bit of a boost. And really not long after, when the United States really fully starts to engage into the Pacific with the forces that we were able to muster up, and to build a new fleet and such like that, you have this Battle of Coral Sea, which is really important because it stops the Japanese advancement toward Australia, which is really a major Allied hub in the Pacific. And if the Japanese had been able to get into Australia, or to make significant blows into Australia, would really have hurt the Allied war effort. And then, of course, you also have another battle at Midway, which is really one of the first major decisive victories against the Japanese after our initial defeats to them. And we're getting this momentum shift, and really once this momentum shift happens, it's going to kind of just keep pushing back, really, to Japan, slowly but surely. And that's obviously super important. I think this is a really great map of the Pacific theater. In particular, there's the red line that it shows in the key there is really the extent of how far the Japanese had controlled in the Pacific. And you can see, if you circle it with, I'm watch the mouse here, you go around. Really, the Japanese had really control of quite a bit of territory here, and they got really close down to Australia here. And this is right here where I'm circling with the mouse, is where this Battle of Coral Sea, and I'm going to zoom in right there. That's why it was so vitally important to have kind of won this battle, because of how close it was to Australia. It was interrupting really shipping lanes and such to Australia to help the Allied war effort. And really, this is the high tide of the Japanese conquest in the Pacific. And as I mentioned, they're going to start to get pushed back by the Allied, really in particular the United States advance. So what the United States adopts as their strategy is called island hopping. And the reason it's obviously called island hopping is because it's really almost playing leapfrog. The United States is essentially trying to take small island after small island, heading really all the way to Japan. And there's a really great video, which is the link here on the top, that kind of shows the advances of the Japanese Empire, and then the pushback again by the United States against the Japanese. And it kind of shows the extent and the kind of the flow of that war. And the idea was, to use these captured islands from the Japanese as kind of bases to leapfrog, and move closer to the Philippines, which had been taken obviously by the Japanese, and ultimately mainland Japan itself. The first major non-naval fighting that took place was at a place called Guadalcanal, and in class you guys watched an episode of the great HBO series The Pacific that kind of dealt with this specifically. And the reason why this is important is the Japanese had been aiming to set up airfields in the Solomon Islands, which is right kind of where this Battle of Coral Sea was taking place, and these airfields would really allow aerial bombardment of Allied ships and shipping route through this area, which would obviously hurt the Allied, effort. This was really tough. And it was really harsh for these Marines that were fighting here, and you obviously see that in the Pacific episode. And in the Pacific episode, you see them arrive at Guadalcanal, and you see the type of fighting that they are having to take place. This is a tropical climate. This is something very, very different than what they're doing in Europe. You have these tropical diseases and tropical bugs and the weather and exposure to deal with, and it's a very harsh climate. This is essentially tropical rainforest that you're fighting these quick, harsh, fast battles with the Japanese here, and the landscape is almost as harsh as the enemy they're fighting in particular. And the Japanese enemy is really known for not wanting to give up. They're tough. They just throw lots of people at the problem, lots of people at the at the Allied and at the American soldiers. They don't want to give up. In the episode, you see one Japanese soldier who had been shot. He holds a grenade essentially, and when one of the American soldiers comes, you try to really to see if he's alive and help him, maybe even. The Japanese soldier kind of stands up and pulls the pin on the grenade and blows himself up with the American soldier. But this is just kind of highlights the attitude that the Japanese soldier actually had in this war, and they were really just a very harsh enemy to deal with, and the Marines in the Pacific were really having a hard time of it. This is just another map of Australia and the surrounding area. On the right, you have the zoomed out map. You can see where the Solomon Islands are located, and on the left there, you have the map that's a little bit more zoomed in, and you can see where Guadalcanal is, and you can see that airplane kind of signifying what they were hoping to have, this airfield that was going to be able to attack and bomb the surrounding areas. I know you guys saw a lot of it in the particular episode of the Pacific that we watched, but this image really also shows the type of environment that these Marines were kind of dealing with. You can see the tropical vegetation behind them, and they're walking through this muck. They're rucking through the muck, as I said up there. It's a very, very harsh climate again, and I can't really emphasize that enough. The exposure issues that these men had to deal with were very serious. So, kind of moving now to the European, or at least the Atlantic area, you have the first real fighting taking place against the Germans by the Americans and such in North Africa. It was really they weren't quite yet ready to move into mainland Europe, and this is actually where they were trying to make the first push in. But the Allies really used Africa as this starting point to get into Europe. You had some major victories in Africa by the Allies against German tank divisions, really, and prevented the Germans from obtaining the really important Suez Canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And again, this was really seen as a stepping stone, because from North Africa, it was really just a quick little jaunt up into Italy. And there was a lot of Allied fighting in 1943, an attempt to kind of overthrow Mussolini, push into Italy, and then hopefully kind of push up into mainland Europe. The Allied advance kind of gets stopped a little bit at Monte Cassino, and they tried to land a little bit farther north near Rome. They get pinned down. They ultimately take Rome in June 1944 and are ready to kind of push up into the mainland Europe, which is really roughly the exact same time as the Allies will now be starting to make the push from the west heading into France. The Americans ultimately, well, really the Allies, used Great Britain as the staging area for the invasion into France and ultimately the main push against the Germans from the west. You had the Russians really doing a brunt of the fighting and even dying in the east against the Germans. But this is really 1944 in June is when the Allies really make that real push to break up Hitler there. And it's really tough because as you can see here, this is actually this image is a picture of the searchlights around Gibraltar, which is the Straits of Gibraltar is the small little strait between Europe and Morocco, which is Africa. But really, on this next page, you can see really the Germans had made what is called the Atlantic Wall, and they had essentially fortified these thousands of miles of coastline in hopes of preventing an invasion by the Allies from working. You can see here the pictures on the right. I can zoom in a little bit up here. You have these fortified little pillboxes where the Germans can be in with machine guns shooting on the beaches. You've got barbed wire preventing movement of the troops around the beach, and then you have mines and obstacles that are all placed in the water, depending on the tides and such, as part of this Atlantic Wall, and a means of attempting to prevent the Allies from getting on shore. This here image is a little more graphic, showing what that kind of really meant. And obviously, there are areas that were a bit more secure and a bit more, ready for this type of invasion. It wasn't quite this well fortified the entire coast, but this is an example of it. You have these gates followed by these mines for the ships that are trying to drop the soldiers off if it was high tide. You've got walls of barbed wire. You've got these other obstacles and such preventing landing craft with these pillboxes and such, of these cliffs. And this is the type of environment that our soldiers are going to have to get through on D-Day, which is June 6th, 1944, when we ultimately, this invasion happened. All right, so D-Day, other words known as Operation Overlord, as I said, took place on June 6, 1944. The main Allied commander was General Eisenhower, at least as far for the United States, and he directed this invasion of France in Normandy. The Allies landed at 5 different beachheads, and they encountered those positions that we had just talked about of this Atlantic Wall. And as a means of trying to ease their way onto the beach, you had the Allies also drop a significant number of paratroopers behind the lines ahead of the landings in hopes that the paratroopers would be able to kind of swing back and take out many of the guns in some of these fortified positions to make it easier for the Allied troops to land on the beaches. But this was a really tough couple of days, really tough day, and then Normandy afterwards was tough for the Allies as well, dealing with all the fortified and the strong German groups there. The it was 156,000 troops, Allied personnel between United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and such. That took part of this, and while that's a lot of people, and the numbers are pretty tough, are pretty rough. You have thousands of people being killed in pretty tough landing. The United States has about 6,000 casualties, about 1,500 of them actually being killed, the other being wounded or taken out of commission. Great Britain has about 2,700. Canada, these numbers for the actual landings might seem a little low, but when you look at the whole month following, the numbers obviously go quite a bit up. But this was really one of the largest military operations in world history. You have the Allies trying to land about 50,000 vehicles, whether they're tanks or cars or jeeps or what, through the use of 5,000 ships and landing craft to deploy the troops, as well as 11,000 planes for bombardment, bombing these fortified positions, and also the transport of the paratroopers trying to get behind the lines. It was really, the scope of this operation was tremendous. So this is an image of the paratroopers that had kind of just jumped out of the plane. Normally this should be moving, but when you see it just running actually on PowerPoint, or you can see that it's a GIF, and the paratroopers jump out, and you can see them kind of falling toward the ground. Uh, and we kind of witnessed that in our episode that we watched of Band of Brothers. Uh, that the Band of Brothers episode that we watched, deals with the Easy Company and the 101st Airborne jumping into Normandy behind those lines. And I was just trying to show you an example of that. And we also looked at D-Day from the lens of the people landing on the beach in the movie Saving Private Ryan as well. And you kind of saw Normandy in a very realistic, obviously, depiction, and really some of the best war production, film that is probably ever been filmed, really. This is another picture of some of the fighting that's going on in Normandy, and you can really, when you look at this picture, you can really appreciate the differences in the type of climate and the type of fighting that these men are having to do in comparison to the men on the Pacific front. This image is from a bit farther east, geographically anyway, in what's known as the Ardennes Forest at the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies, they take control of Normandy, and they push through northern France into Holland and Belgium. And what happens is the Allied get kind of pinned down by this major German tank offensive, and just major German offensive in general, with some of the major fighting taking place up here in this forest. And then it's in winter time, so you can tell it's the climate that they have in Europe is very similar to what we have here in the Northeast United States. These men are stuck out in the cold, and oftentimes they don't have the supplies that are necessary to keep them warm. It's very tough. Picture bombardment, and picture these trees being blown up like crazy by mortars and shelling and such. These men being in foxholes. This is a very, very tough situation for these men. And ultimately, the Battle of the Bulge is going to be kind of one of the last major offenses by the German before we start really pushing our way toward Germany. And remember, the Russians are pushing from the east as well, and not much longer after this, we're kind of making who's going to be getting into Germany, and who's going to be getting to Berlin first. I just wanted to take a quick break from the war effort actually in Europe, or in the Pacific, and really just talk briefly about the home front and what the home front was like. At home, you have to remember, this is a total war effort. Everyone is essentially being asked to do their part in whatever way that they can to aid this effort. And some of those things that we were talking about in particular are these rationings, limiting supplies that might be crucial in the war effort, just making that sacrifice at home, whether or not you get a job in production, making war supplies, making bombs, making welding for planes, and making planes and tanks, and then these vehicles. There's obviously massive amounts of propaganda that are being pushed out, influencing the thought. We looked at one just earlier, trying to get you to obviously hate the Japanese for what they were doing to the Americans in the Philippines. Things like war bonds are also being asked of people, to pay money to help the war effort, essentially, and you get that money back later with interest. We obviously need to finance this large-scale operation, and war bonds was one of the way that they were trying to do that. So this picture here is what I'm kind of talking about. You have a number of women that are doing a lot of jobs at home, and this one I like because it kind of shows where these posters are coming from. Right, someone's got to make the posters, and you have all these women in here. I think it's a colorized image. I'm not sure if it was actually taken in color of these posters, and they're all making this danger is real poster, trying to elicit this response and this emotional response by the public. And you can see some of the propaganda there off in the background. This is a really great image as well. It kind of shows, again, the more human element of all this, and the production. And during this war, again, many of the men were off fighting in this war, and you really didn't have too many men at home anymore. So a lot of the women and girls, even if you look at this girl, had to step up and do their part to really help keep this war effort on, right? This war is not just fought on the battlefields. If the production at home and didn't keep up with the rate that it was being used, if you didn't have the tanks you needed, or the ammo you needed, or the shells you needed for your cannons and such, the war wouldn't be able to go on. So without this effort at home, you wouldn't have that. So, I like this image because it just, shows how young these people really are. Often at home you have these young girls, or you even have these young men that are signing up, 16, 17, with permission from their parents, that are getting into the war. And this is just another of these real life kind of Rosie the Riveter situations where the women are doing, these work, and I think she looks like she's putting together some sort of welding for a tank or a plane or something behind her. I can't really quite tell. So back to the Pacific Front here, and as we kind of said, the United States had adopted this kind of island hopping strategy, and we used that island hopping strategy to really get close again to the Japan mainland. We have this really big battle in the Philippines to take the Philippines back, known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And this really is the largest naval battle of the war. You have major, Japanese fleet losses to the Americans, and this kind of paves the way for even pushing closer to mainland Japan. We had rescued, the Philippines from the Japanese, and there's two other major, landings that take place heading toward the Japanese mainland at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. You remember that article we read in class about the mass suicides of the Okinawan people, forced upon them by the Japanese soldiers. But these landings here weren't so dissimilar to the landings that we kind of talked about with the D-Day invasion. These fortified positions, and landing on these beaches, and the Marines just kind of spilling out onto the beach with this major gunfire and shellings and stuff that are taking place. But they would, obviously prove to be strategic islands, heading toward mainland Japan as we kind of got closer to hopefully wrap this. These are just kind of two quick maps to show you where, in relation to Japan, I was talking about with Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All right, so kind of now the end of the war and how this all wraps up. You actually have President Roosevelt die in April of 1945. So he doesn't get to actually see this war come to a conclusion. And the man that takes over from him is a man named Harry Truman, who becomes president as he was the vice president. And the Allies eventually, as we said, kind of start closing in on Berlin and Germany, the Nazi heartland here. You have the Americans kind of pushing in from the west, and you have the Russians pushing in from the east. And ultimately, Hitler kills himself, and really not too long after, just a couple of days, you have the full surrender of the German army on May 8th or May 9th, depending on where you were at the time, depending on where you got the news. And you have this VE Day, known as Victory in Europe. And the soldiers that were here, they're going to actually need to be used in Japan. So the soldiers that were in Europe, who had kind of now seen the fighting kind of coming to a stopping point, or at least less fighting for a while, a lot safer for them, they're now going to have to be considered for this potential full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, because the war had not wrapped up yet in the Pacific. We are going to get the VJ Day, which is the victory in Japan, just a couple months later, and we're going to cover that here. So this image is a picture of Berlin, and what Berlin looked like in the state of Berlin, right, as the Allies were getting ready to take it. The one thing that was very different in World War II in comparison to World War I is really the aerial superiority and the changes in aerial combat and really bombardment. The fact that you could drop these bombs from the sky was a really changed the face of war, and all of this destruction was essentially done by these bombings. And World War II is interesting because you get this change in attitude in war that it's really okay to target, around civilians. And if civilians are being killed in these bombings, if you're hitting military targets, or even if you're not even hitting military targets, it's accepted. And some people will even say, well, the civilians at home who are doing all of this production for the war and making sure the war effort is still going, are they really even considered civilians at all? And it really, it's hard to think about, because you have so many people that really aren't even fighting, that are just being killed by these pretty much indiscriminate bombings by both sides, in particular the Allies, as we get toward the end of the war. So the Japanese were, as I said, kind of a really tough enemy, right? They didn't want to surrender, and they wanted to surrender on their own terms. They wanted to make sure the emperor could stay in power if this was going to happen. And Harry Truman, when he becomes president after the death of Roosevelt, learns of the creation of the atomic bomb and the ability to potentially use this bomb in the relatively immediate future. The atomic bomb had been developed by a lot more famous scientists, but two in particular, Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. The bomb was developed in what's known as the Manhattan Project, and the atomic bomb is something very different than all the other type of weaponry that had been being used. Obviously, the indiscriminate nature of the atomic bomb, and the size of and the destruction of these bombs, really made them quite a bit different in their power and the way the world looks at them. The Americans dropped two atomic bombs, and these still are really the only two atomic bombs that have ever been dropped for military reasons, not just in tests. The first is dropped on August 6th, 1945, at the city of Hiroshima, and the second is dropped 3 days later after the Japanese still refused to surrender at another city known as Nagasaki. And the reason why a major city, or at least I should say, the capital city and such, wasn't targeted in particular, is that Tokyo had already been really essentially destroyed by the American fire bombings of the city. You actually had really over 100,000 people dead in Tokyo, and much of the city was still wooden constructions, and you had the Americans using what's known as incendiary bombs, which bombs that essentially light everything on fire, and they burn down the city, and you killed thousands of these people in these fire bombings before. So they were attacking other cities that had not really taken much of the brunt of these bombings. So really, the question becomes, were these atomic bombs actually, the use of them, was it justified? And in examining a question like this, you really need to kind of put yourself into the shoes of someone, say 70 years ago, really, at this point. And you obviously have I've heard stories of men that are basically 100% convinced that the dropping of the atomic bombs in the Pacific really saved their lives, because they would not have to go and commit, have a full-scale invasion of the mainland of Japan against an enemy that, doesn't want to give up and never wants to surrender and is willing to kind of fight to the last breath. The question becomes is, how many American lives did dropping these atomic bombs save? It obviously didn't have to have the invasion. Dropping the atomic bombs, and essentially, it was obviously hoping to end the war outright, and it more or less did. It did take the dropping of two to do it before the Japanese unconditionally surrendered. The question is, did this limit unnecessary deaths? For sure. Was it going to? It stops the indiscriminate fire bombings of these Japanese cities that had been taking place. Many people are going to also argue that the atomic bombs were really more for a show against the Soviets, in particular Stalin, who had been moving east to that and was going to, potentially get to Japan and maybe even invade Japan before the United States was. So there's lots of reasons why you could say that these bombs were justified at the time, but that doesn't really change the fact that each bomb killed roughly 70,000 people outright in these indiscriminate, completely devastating, destructive attacks. Again, as I said, each bomb killed 70,000 outright. So you have about 140,000 dead from just the blast alone. You have 70,000 that are going to die from the fallout and radiation of these atomic bombs after the fact. And those numbers alone are more deaths than the Allies are going to have in the entire Pacific War. So when it comes down to it, it's a serious number of people, and the question becomes: is it okay to kill these people that really had nothing to do with fighting the war anyway? And is it justifiable to kill civilians mixed in with these military targets? And it's a really tough question to answer, and maybe there isn't even an answer. It's just something that's worth pondering over. So the Americans looked, and the Allies really looked, for complete unconditional surrenders from both the Germans and the Japanese, which really means that they wanted to write the terms of the surrender, that they get what they wanted. And as I said, victory in Japan VJ Day was August 15th, so actually 6 days or so after the second atomic bomb was dropped. You finally have this peace across the world, roughly 6 years after it began. You have the whole conflict worldwide. You've got roughly 50, 60 million people that are killed. The Americans really taking a very small percentage of that, with really only about 300,000 Americans that were killed, another 800,000 wounded. But the rest of the world, especially places like Russia, took the brunt of these deaths. And you have a very famous picture here, celebrating the end of the war. You have the sailor here kissing the nurse in the streets. Very famous photograph. But before we wrap this up, I think it's worth noting and taking a look at the number of deaths in this war. And again, this is the deadliest conflict and perhaps like the largest conflict in human history that we know of. And if you look here at this infographic, as the amount of deaths that are taking place here, that had taken place here, the Soviet Union lost roughly 24 million people between civilian deaths and military deaths, and actually they're split roughly halfway between this. China lost a serious number of civilians. They're losing roughly 16, 17 million or so based off of this. If you look, some of these are military deaths. You can see the percentage here. So Soviets lost roughly 13% of their entire population. Those numbers are pretty staggering. And Germany lost a good amount too. They lost roughly, looks like 11% of their total population. Mostly military casualties here. But look at the actual number of deaths. Between the Axis civilians and the Allied civilians, 62% of the people that died in this war were people that weren't even fighting in this war. And it's just crazy to think about and look at. And the United States took a very small percentage of this, which right here you can see, even Great Britain too. So you can see the big losers here at the end of this war, and wrapping this all up.